Welcome to Baruch Menashe's podcast. This is a space for rigorous exploration of human development, psychology, and social interactivity. Each episode examines the underlying structures of thought, behavior, and interaction, offering insights drawn from education, research, and philosophical reflection. Here we engage deeply with ideas, question assumptions, and illuminate the patterns that shape both individual growth and collective experience. Join me as we unpack complex concepts and translate them into understanding, perspective, and meaningful dialogue. There are two distinct possibilities between the access of sexuality that would concur with an intellectual development as well to be further the premise of a dynamic that would lead to existential procurement. The reason for this, that it is binary, is not for the identity formations that come after the sexual manifestation of individual beings, but rather because each serves the extreme of an impossible balance that would never have a medium in place, since it relies on objectivity and subjectivity as its first premise. It is no wonder that early psychoanalysts discussed sexuality as in terms of sexual object, rather than a sexual manifestation external of subjectivity. This is because it is really an object rather than a proprietary manifestation of being phenomenon. The reason it is an object rather than what would one assume in identity formation is that one is orienting themselves into external phenomenon in its fundamental integration. If we agree that convergence is the primary or one of the primary possibilities of manifestation for organisms, and especially cognizant organisms, then it requires a mediation between objectivity and subjective force. The object, that of what is external, is thus going to be most precedent for integration of individuality to prove convergence, to facilitate convergence, and finally to become convergence. The reason we reach to extremes in this process is because each side is met with its vulnerability, being that convergence is most important. The sexual individual, the individual who realizes integration at a fundamental level, will in kind identify the external object to become the promise of its failure. The reason that convergence is as well a failure is because it consolidates as its constitution. And consolidation is also the notion of decay, or finally, the outcome of all consolidation is nothingness. It is the convergence of itself upon itself without regulation. Thus, we don't get a balance of sexuality, because if we are to attempt balance, we are also going to become lost to its fundamental purpose, that is to facilitate the extreme of proving that convergence is not fundamental and rather is a process in and of itself. That is, it is not only convergence that facilitates sexuality, but its avoidance of convergence as well, because it is built in with its vulnerability at the onset. The more we attempt balance of the extremes in sexuality, the more we lose its fundamentals and thus deviate into utility of sexuality, but more so to become a new conceptual system that has no relation to sexuality, and finally to be devoid of all its stimulation and purpose. This is the general problem of convergence that is sought after in the sexual domain, because it ignores the notion that it also serves in its vulnerability to avoid convergence, so that in its attempt of continuous convergence, two other extremes manifest that are both deviating of its sexual process, but also of its final purpose. One of the extremes is a loss of detail of the proprietary beings, but also the original state of non-convergence, that is, the fundamentalness of nature, which convergence is only its secondary position, which allows for organism manifestation, but in this case becomes devoid of itself for lack of stimulation. It is thus rather promising that any attempted continuous convergence of male-female or sexual interface will incur a penalty of a lack of stimulatory response and sexual manifestation, and finally identity formation that would be required for a reconfigurement, having lost the existential purpose of its product. Thus, at all times, both systems must work together, avoidance of convergence and convergence. As well, the avoidance of convergence can also lead to attempted convergence to manifest most organically, but most extreme. When one avoids convergence, when the constitution of their being is to converge, what occurs is the final product of convergence that does not lead to the existential exchange of that convergence, but rather is the compelled attachment of the vitalization of being that has been avoided henceforth. It is rather the aggravated system that requires a reconstitution of its affairs that leads to finally a convergence that becomes disruptive to its own system, as well to the sexual object. This is the general problem of utilizing sexuality and its convergence to set the new process in place, because what it is doing is reconstituting without the realization that it must at all times remain at some level of avoidance to that very convergence. But when it becomes existential as a process, it almost manifests as a new beginning that is really a detriment of all development henceforth. The interchange is not for a new beginning or a new process, but rather in some form of continuity and in some form of convergence. This is almost the cliche that manifests in illicit relationships or improper ones, for whatever the reason that it becomes improper, whether socially, politically, or individually, psychologically, meaning in which that usually uses terminology of newness and novelty, because it is attempting an existential convergence that ignores the preceding effect of non-convergence which requires that dynamic duo. Conclusively, sexuality is thus, in some sense, nature's extreme, which in regular case is in balance. So it is on one side a deterrence of all nature's process, so that the individual requires the balancing act that nature is not offering. In the regular case, nature is the one providing balance. There is interchange and dynamic at all stages, so that the individual is required to push that limit, push it to, at some level, its extreme, to push the bar of what is possible, so to speak. But when it comes to the arena of sexuality, it reverses that scenario, for nature is at its extreme already, being that it is attempting convergence while remaining non-convergence as its constitutional primary state, so that the individual is thus tasked with the balance. And thus, when it is not sought in balance, when it is pushed to its extreme of either convergence or non-convergence, then it is not facilitating the dynamic between an individual and what was set forth of nature. But more importantly, it will automatically manifest the alternative, so that if pushed to the extreme in the individual landscape of either convergence, it will lead to non-convergence, or if it is pushed to the extreme of non-convergence, it will lead to convergence, but in a manner that doesn't facilitate finally its product, because in the natural organic manifestation of nature, it was already in a state of extreme, so that there is no balancing effect fundamentally. Thus, one is tasked at the organic level of balance, which in every other scenario of nature is the opposite.